You're watching the International Luxury Hotel Association webinar series. We unite a global ecosystem of over 1 million professionals to cut through the noise and architect the future of luxury hospitality. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the International Luxury Hotel Association's March Trends webinar. Today, we're focusing on a fundamental shift happening across luxury hospitality. The guest in 2026 is not asking for more, they're asking for better. Better rest, better recognition, better flow, better return on their time. And for owners and operators, the competitive advantage isn't about layering on additional amenities. It's about knowing what to simplify, where to invest, and what actually drives long-term value. This session is just designed to be practical. We're not here to talk about trends and theory. We're here to talk about decisions. What's working, what's being cut, and what is genuinely driving pricing power, loyalty, and asset performance. We're organizing the conversation around 3 guest lenses: how the guest wants to feel, how the guest wants to be recognized and understood, and how the guest wants to move through the property frictionlessly. We'll start with the most fundamental question facing luxury hotels today. What emotional outcome are guests actually paying for, and how are owners translating that into measurable value? So now we're going to talk about how the guest wants to feel. And to open this section, I'm joined with Michelle Russo, founder and CEO of hotelAVE. Michelle works across a broad portfolio of luxury assets, advising owners and brands on performance, positioning, and long-term value creation. She sees in real time where experiential investments are driving rate and where they're simply adding costs. Thanks for joining us, Michelle.
Nice to be here.
So from what you're seeing across luxury assets today, what are emotional outcomes are guests truly paying for today, and how has that shifted over the past few years?
It's a good question, and we track this carefully. We have a lot of luxury properties in our portfolio, and if you look back, there's been a transition from spending on goods to experiences. Some data point from Bain that 70% of luxury discretionary spending is now on experiences. So it speaks to a willingness, right, on the part of the consumer. If you can deliver an experience, right, that there doesn't seem to be a limit for what they'll pay. Now, that said, still looking for value for money. And a big part of those travel trends that we're seeing is a higher demand for personalized itineraries. So personalization is a big theme. And a lot of that personalization we've learned from our different operator partners is driven by the people that provide the service and the experience. So that shift we've seen, right? Time being a commodity as well as money. So wanting, a great experience for the time spend, and personal enrichment are some other themes. And from a hotel owner perspective, right, the value proposition is not just driving demand, but either creating repeat or referral business.
Great. And where do you see hotels or brands over-investing in experiences that don't meaningfully move rate or loyalty or long-term value?
So probably a simple one is like a lot of effort on short-term food and beverage pop-ups, right? Those are very local versus hotel room night generating. Can take a lot of effort versus a chef in residence that has a longer program that you can tie to an exclusive offer where you can tie to stay here, you're guaranteed reservations. One of the hotels that recently opened in our portfolio, the one and only in Moonlight Basin, they've done a lot of awareness advertising as part of their opening, which is very hard to ROI, but that is still important, even though it's right hard from an owner perspective to ROI to create awareness. And I would say, and I bring them up to highlight that their approach has been very really pulling at those emotional strings. Like you really want to be there. You know, they've done a great job at creating that interest in the property, even, just even through showing landscape or, just really simple presentation. So there are things that you could say are overinvested or don't have ROIs that owners support doing right at an opening versus things, kind of for a more stabilized property. To your point, that's a lot of effort and doesn't generate room nights, like the pop-up example.
Sure, and those are two very good examples. One sort of building that long-term brand view. Um, and how are owners reframing guest experience as a driver of sustained pricing power and asset performance rather than short-term RevPAR?
So it's interesting. We put goals together for each of our hotels in our asset management plans, and for our luxury properties this year, this is a big theme of defining guest experiences, presenting prospective itineraries to give customers an idea of the different things that they can do that they may not have thought about. And I would say that the key elements that we're focused on with our hotels is experiences that create that personal connection, but that also can be executable, right? Like you don't want to be aspirational and get out over your skis and not be able to deliver. So a simple example would be at a resort that maybe has kind of a unique venue by a riverbed or in their garden, and it's a chef lunch, and so the chef cooks there and it's just your little group. And so it's very executable. It's unique. It showcases a unique aspect of the resort without having to kind of over program the experience, and it creates that personal connection.
Fantastic. Well, thanks. It's been really good to speak with you today, and we appreciate you joining us.
Thank you. Have a good day.
To build on the investor's perspective, I'm joined by Samantha Sugarman, Senior Vice President, Strategic Operations with Trinity Investments. Sam brings the owner and investment lens, translating emotion into underwriting, valuation, and long-term asset performance. Sam, it's good to speak to you today.
Thank you for having me, Sharon.
So, what emotional outcome do you believe luxury guests are actually paying for today? And how does that show up in rate resilience or valuation?
It's a great question. I think we all know the mantra that guests won't remember what you said or what you did, but they'll remember how you made them feel. And we ask it a lot at Trinity because we invest transformatively into a lot of our assets. And it's important to take a step back and ask, what are we trying to accomplish? Quite obviously, it's increase the value of the property and drive IRR. But how do you do that? And I kind of break it down into connection. And I think connection has three different components to it. One, connection to people. So we invest in spaces that foster meaningful connection between people and the other guests that they brought with them. So their families, maybe loved ones, their girlfriends, they're on an outing, but also perhaps a connection to other guests, the community with them as well. So investing in programming and amenities that help drive those. Or maybe it's even guest room configurations, and you're creating a guest rooms that connect or have a central meeting space that people can gather with their parties. Allows us to compete with vacation rentals. But I think a lot of hotels miss the boat on being able to make those types of guest room configurations easily bookable for people. And that's why people go to places like Airbnb. But another place that you can really drive connection is through your associates and training them and investing in training for your associates to know when they can actually go off script and to create an experience for the guests that will stick with them. So connection to people is one. Connection to place. both the property and the destination. We all know designing for a sense of place is extremely important, but also how do you create authenticity without gimmick? Our properties need cohesive messaging. When we go through transformations at our assets, we engage with branding agencies who help us come up with a positioning and a point of view, I would say. The property has to have a point of view that's authentic. And then everything from the in-room collateral to the messaging has to align with that so that when people come to your property, they feel like they're actually connecting with something that's meaningful for them. And then the third, so people, place, connection to self. And we see that through our investments in wellness and creating programming that allow people to have fitness experiences, and then people spend on property in those ways. So when you're able to invest in those and create those moments of connection, this relates a little bit to what Michelle said. You really drive customers that want to come back to your property. It stays with them. They remember how you made them feel, and they become repeat guests, and they have referrals. And so your cost of acquisition for those guests who are going to book direct for you is much lower, and you have higher ratings on websites. So your sort order is going to be higher on OTA websites. You don't have to invest in travel ads to the same extent because you're already coming up high because people are repeatedly saying that they enjoy staying with you. And lastly, I'll say happy guests spend more on property. They're happy to give you your money. So create experiences that they're willing to pay for.
Sure, meeting them where they are. And so where have you seen emotional or experiential investments clearly deliver ROI versus generating positive sentiment without financial return?
Sometimes it's hard to draw a direct line between the investment you're making in a specific amenity or programming and an increase in profit. Food and beverage is a great example of that. At Trinity, we believe heavily that food and beverage is a really important part of the experience of guests on property. And it's really difficult to underwrite a 20% IRR on a multi-million-dollar renovation of a food and beverage outlet. But we believe that when people come to property and they have delicious food, a transformational experience at your dining room table, that they're going to remember that, and that's going to cause them to want to come back to your properties. Another example is at the Fairmont Olympic in Seattle, we do a Reset and Rise wellness series. And we invite guests, a guest amenity, but we get a lot of locals that come to this this experience that we do with our spa, and Equinox is a partner for it. And it connects people to their bodies, it connects people to the hotel and our meeting spaces, and it connects them to the community. And we don't see a huge profit boost from that, but we think that all those other things are just as important. And so what I'm talking about really is the halo effect, right? The investments and how do you decide whether or not to make those investments? And we believe in the halo effect, but you really have to have governance and discipline when you start to invest in those. And so what does that mean? It's creating a budget. If you're going to do an experience, someone has to take ownership of a budget. I've seen some of these experiences go wild where people get really excited, but you need to have some type of structure to how much you're actually spending when you do these types of programs. You need to understand who your target market is also when you start thinking about experiences and amenities. Once you understand your target market, you can create a structured marketing campaign around it. As I said, our spa and Equinox across the street leaned into their marketing distribution list and allowed us to really get exposure to new customers to come and see the hotel. And you really need to define your KPIs. What does success look like for you for this event that you're doing? It can be monetary, it can be profit, or it can be guest satisfaction scores. But make sure you define what your success is going to look like before you start investing. And then afterwards, you need to do a post-event evaluation, right? How much did we actually end up spending? And did we accomplish what we were looking to accomplish? That way you can decide whether you repeat it, you refine it, or you retire it. Because if you do it again and you lose as much money or you spend as much and you're not getting returns, you may not know if you haven't measured it and you haven't had that conversation. So really important that when you start to invest in experiences, while there might not be a direct ROI, there's a way to create a halo effect that's additive to the property without going overboard. You just need to have the right governance and discipline.
Sharon, you've given us a really good plan to measure the success of an experiential guest experience. So is there anything that hotels are missing or that you're seeing, something get lost along the way where owners don't recognize when emotional value has plateaued? And additional investment doesn't make sense, even if guests like it?
Oh, yes. There's probably two main ways that you can get this emotional value plateau. One is when the program just becomes so complex over time, and you start having more complexity than revenue or value coming out of it. And I saw this, one of our properties did a food and wine weekend symposium. And every year they just said, well, if we just go a little bit bigger, if we invite more celebrity guests, if we have more media partners, then it will be successful. And they kept adding to it and wanting to make it bigger and better. And they weren't seeing the increases in ADR or occupancy or even media impressions. And so at some point you just have to make the decision that you're having complexity without yield, right? Which creates margin leakage for yourself. And you need to have a real religious moment and decide that it's not something that's worth pursuing in its current form. I think the other way that emotional plateau happens, when your competition starts copying you, when it becomes table stakes, when everyone is doing the same thing. At that point, maybe it's not worth continuing to add complexity, but instead you look at what you're providing and you refine it and you make it efficient. And there's consistency in it, but you're no longer expanding, but you can create the same emotional outcome just more efficiently. And so I'm not saying scrap it all together, but perhaps change how you're trying to continue to evolve that program.
Great. Well, you've given us a lot to think about, so thank you. It's been good speaking with you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we've just heard how investors and owners think about emotional outcomes in terms of value and return. Will Gilbert, co-founder of Bodhi, brings the translation layer, how these outcomes are actually engineered day to day inside the building itself. So his perspective connects human physiology, building systems, and technology, turning some feeling restored from a concept into something measurable, repeatable, and operational. So welcome, Will. Good to speak to you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So in 2026, what does feeling restored actually map to in the built environment? If you had to pick the top sort of 2 to 3 environmental factors, sleep conditions, temperature, stability, air quality, lighting, acoustics, what most reliably changes how guests feel?
Well, the first thing is, I think all those things matter. But the first part of it is making sure that those systems that deliver those things like temperature, all those systems are functioning. The guest isn't checking into a room where the lights aren't working or the temperature is too hot or too humid. So if you're out to pick something there, though, sleep conditions are number one. The best way to feel good the next day is having a good night's sleep, and it's really difficult to do if the room is too hot, if the lights are not turning off, if the TV's not working correctly, or there's noises in the room. Being able to have sensors to detect those kind of anomalies, odor especially another one. So I think all of those, but really it comes down to the very beginning. Making sure those systems are all actually working when that guest gets in that room, and that's something that we're doing on the implementation side with Bodhi.
Great. And where are you seeing the strongest ROI for hotels investing in smart building and AI-driven comfort?
So everyone talks about asset management, right, in hotels, and the guest is the most important asset, because without the guest, the hotel doesn't work. You have to have people that come and stay, and they love the property, and they go home and they tell their friends and family, and people start booking that property. And so guest satisfaction, and going back to the original question of the best thing of feeling restored and these different systems working. So guest satisfaction, not having that negative review, it's a huge ROI. If you go and start having, after two complaints, you'll lose bookings up to 70%. It's a massive amount of money. Of course, now from the money part, energy savings, smart thermostats, you can go ahead and put those into properties for energy conservation. Smart thermostats will lead to 20-25% in savings. When you put Bodhi on top of it, up to 40 and 45%. Right. So two parts there, the hotels for ROI, the big thing, energy consumption, and the other part is those negative reviews.
Fantastic. And as you said, it accumulates so fast. So, and how do you deliver personalization without making the experience feel intrusive or complicated?
Well, the first part is everyone's talking about, preferences and things like that. Personalization to me is being able to use my own device, right? So that's step one. And then step two is not having to install an app on the phone when I get to the property, right? So we've solved that problem by connecting the entire property to Bodhi. We're able to offer something very unique that no one else can do. So upon check-in, we come in, they'll say, "Welcome to this hotel. Click this link," or you click this link. Nothing to install on your phone. You can unlock your door. You can order food and beverage. You can interact with your room, set the temperature, interact with Bodhi Guest GPT. Being able to have those requests for things like towels or restaurant recommendations. But the really cool thing that we can do with it is that you can actually use it as the first line of complaining. If you want to go on there and say my television's not working, or my lights won't turn off, or my room is too hot. Since Bodhi's integrated with all these different systems in the property, we're that first line of defense. We're the ones that can triage the issue first before bringing it back to a person at the property. And so, for me, that personalization starts with my own device and being able to use something that's connected to the entire property.
Fantastic. Thanks, Will. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Feeling restored is table stakes. The next expectation is more nuanced. Guests want to feel known but not managed. In 2026, recognition has become more sophisticated. Guests expect personalization, but they also expect discretion. They want brands to remember what matters and ignore what doesn't. So the question becomes, how do luxury hotels decide what to remember, what to act on, and how to do it without adding friction? To open this section on how the guest wants to be understood, I'm joined by Rachael Palumbo, Senior Vice President of Global Hotel Brand Marketing at Nobu Hospitality. Rachael brings the global lifestyle brand perspective where experience, identity, and consistency must work together across markets. Nobu is both iconic and intimate. That balance makes this question of recognition especially interesting. Welcome, Rachael.
Thank you, Sharon. I appreciate you having me.
So in a lifestyle-driven brand like Nobu, what does feeling understood mean to today's luxury guest? And how does that influence loyalty and repeat stays?
So for Nobu, feeling understood means, of course, anticipating the guest preferences without being intrusive or managed, as you mentioned earlier. So recognizing how they experience Nobu as a full ecosystem is very important to us because we are a dining-rooted brand. So our guests go between hotel, restaurant, and residences as well in our communities. So recognizing them is more important than ever. The brand is over 32 years old. We started with our restaurant in Tribeca many years ago and evolved to where we are today with hotels, restaurants around the world. So with that, we always go back to our roots, and that would be the dining. Understanding their preferences from that perspective is quite different than just from a hotel stay. We learn how they like to experience their cuisine, their, of course, allergies or preferences in foods, and all of that is common knowledge for our teams to really get to know our regular guests over the years. Where they like to sit in the restaurant, who they like to be interacting with from the Nobu staff. So we are always keyed into that, and I think that's very important in how we do this on the hotel side. Because when service feels intuitive and personal, I feel, they feel a sense of belonging within our community. And as much as we are lifestyle, we are luxury lifestyle. So we have kind of the best of both worlds. We're not so formal as a traditional luxury property, and we're not as lifestyle where, you're walking into, let's say, a cocktail party in the lobby or, there's energy everywhere. We keep the energy in the restaurant and the lounge space. And our hotel has more of a calm feeling throughout the property, the hallways, the guest room area. So that is really how we keep our guests within that Nobu ecosystem. So it's natural, and I think that's what it has to come across as too. But one thing I will just point out, making guests feel understood is complicated because people tend to make assumptions about what guests want. They want champagne on ice, they want romantic setups. Well, that might not be luxury to every guest, and I think that's where we really need to do more of our pre-work before the guest arrives through preferences. But again, doing it in a non-intrusive manner, picking up on certain things. And this is where we communicate so much through the restaurant because many of our guests are restaurant customers. So we find out where they dine. We ask that maitre d' or the general manager of that property for details about that guest, their preferences on what they like to drink and eat and all of that. And that really complements our stays. And it's been quite successful going through those channels. But that's important, is just learning what really matters to them. And maybe no interaction is luxury to a guest. Maybe that's something that you need to pick up on early. And we have, a very, quick check-in process. So all of these things are so important and really affect the overall guest touch points. It's just getting to know them.
Fantastic. And it's a tricky balance. Like, where does that personalization genuinely enhance the Nobu experience, and where does restraint preserve the brand integrity?
So, I would say that personalization enhances the experience when it supports comfort, right? And being familiar with what your surroundings. Such as dining preferences, the setup of the room, whether, they like the desk in a certain area or, the bed turned down or, certain pillows, all of those types of things, or wellness routines that they wake up at 5 a.m. to go to the fitness center and all of that. Timing around things like housekeeping. I think that's a huge luxury that many guests, sometimes you're in a room and you're always trying to schedule yourself around the housekeeper. And that shouldn't be how this day goes. So things like that, that's what our staff needs to really perfect, is really working around schedules. And I think that's, something that really helps us. And, restraint, it definitely comes into play. I think for luxury brands, there is, that needs to be very prevalent. Where we are with our dining, for instance, Nobu's design, service style, the presentation, it's consistent and intentional. We don't put things on the table that are unnecessary. And that's very much one of our philosophies, is keeping things uncluttered. Same with the guest rooms. So that shows restraint. We don't put logos all over our guest rooms, excuse me. We keep them very simple, very minimalistic. And that allows a guest to feel calm and really, I would say, kind of get into the mood of being in the hotel and feeling that, they're not in a cluttered space with a lot of distraction. And many people are on these trips to really get away from, their business and just in general to escape. So truly, that's an important part of what we do with the restraint.
Sure. And how do you balance global brand consistency with local identity so guests feel part of something iconic, but also personally recognized?
So Nobu maintains a very consistent foundation. Signature cuisine, the thoughtful design, as I just mentioned, with the uncluttered kind of guest room, simplified, and what we like to call the spirit of omotenashi. And what omotenashi is the Japanese philosophy of hospitality. So, it's a very special approach to hospitality, and it really ties all these things we've discussed into, a guest experience, right? Not being intrusive, really reading signals and picking up on them within that framework. Each property reflects its location, though. So we have this strong brand foundation that's consistent through all the properties. And then each property brings their local destination in through architecture. None of our properties look the same. They all look very specific to their location. Nobu-san himself, when he comes into the property initially, he will go to the market, the fish market. He will meet with all the local vendors. We buy local ingredients, as many restaurants do, but this is something that's very important to him. And before we even go into a destination with a development, it has to be obviously approved by our founders. And Nobu-san is very, it's very important to him that there's good local offering, that he is able to get the fish that we need to serve to our guests and all of that, but it has to really reflect his brand standards, and our overall brand standards. And then cultural influences and community connections. We like to bring that into our properties. We have, offers that we call Explore Nobu or Explore the Destination Name. And we challenge our properties to put together a really interesting offering of local experiences that don't feel too managed or, like a cruise director. You don't want that because many guests, they don't always want those things. But we tie in local experiences that can be, added or deleted, experienced briefly, or if they want something more drawn out, we can do that on an itinerary. So we really try to bring that local flavor in. And of course, our restaurants are fed very much by the local market. So we rely heavily on that local customer to come in. And I really feel that that makes the property feel alive. And everyone wants to stay at a hotel where you feel that that restaurant is the hottest restaurant in that market. So that's very important to us when we go into a destination is that local customer. So that really brings in that feel of being in a destination. And the result is an experience that feels unmistakably Nobu while still connected to the destination.
Well, thank you. It's been great to speak with you today and learn how the guest really would like to be understood, and you're doing amazing things.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Sharon. I appreciate it.
Balance between recognition and restraint is such a critical tension for luxury brands. To expand the lens from brand strategy to customer intelligence at scale, I'm joined by Jill Hunt, Vice President of Customer Experience at Encore. Welcome, Jill.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So Jill brings the customer insight and operational translation perspective, how guest feedback data and AI move from observation to execution. So Jill, what does feeling understood look like now in luxury experiences? And where does personalization actually add value versus slow things down?
I think that there's been a real shift in how people want to be kind of immersed in the luxury experience. And so it probably used to be very much about, I would say excess, right? Now I think it's really moved a little bit around feeling seen, recognized, and really understood as the individual. And that also can translate into those experiences for the customers. So if we think about our meeting planners and the events that they're trying to put together for their customers within a luxury experience, not only do we need to understand the meeting planner customer and their individual needs, their individual goals, the industry with they work, they're also trying to create a very individualized experience for their attendees. And so I think that one of the things we can think about is that if personalization is done well, it doesn't slow things down. It removes everything that didn't even need to be there in the first place. So if you're spending the time to really understand the needs of the individuals coming, what their interests are, and working with that data in real time, you can really create a much more seamless experience for everybody within that event. And that should feel very different within that luxury space.
Absolutely. And how does Encore's customer research tool change that pre-planning stage for teams and for the customer? And what has it replaced operationally?
So our customer research tool is incredible and really well built exactly for what I just mentioned about how customers want to feel in the luxury experience. We have the ability to look at the customer, everything about them before that event we're working with them on, so their history, but also looking at them in the future. And so it brings together our teams to have one view, and that customer should feel already known. They should already understand our preferences. They're able to look at, hey, this event, you had these types of pieces and parts to it. We can see their survey data. We see that you were, you gave us a really high OSAT score. You had comments. Our customers give us a lot of comments. We can look at those comments and say, that's great. So let's expand on that. Let's really take what worked well, and now let's look at this particular event. And so it really gives more confidence and less friction. And it really took out, I would tell you, it took out time, right? And friction on our end, where our sellers would have to open up maybe 20 tabs and find the data in all of these different places. It's all brought together, and they can take it on the go. So a lot of times you're not just sitting in front of your desk, right? You're out there walking through the hotel with the customer, and you're able to just pull that information up right at your fingertips and immediately get to work with that customer and take a lot of time and friction out of the process.
That's fantastic. And to expand on AI, how are you using AI to translate open-ended feedback into actionable insight? And what kind of improvements are you seeing as a result?
Yeah, this is very exciting for us. So as I mentioned, our customers write a lot of comments in our surveys, which is incredible. I love that. Qualitative information is just much richer in the insights that we can pull out of that. And so AI is just speeding this all up for us. So we're able to move from getting that data coming in to analyzing it a lot faster and identifying any root cause issues. And that we can now connect to action planning. We have a close the loop process where we can very quickly call, pick up the phone and call the customer if there was a problem and start to resolve that problem much faster than we were able to before. We can also understand what happened across, I would tell you, it takes more than one person to resolve a customer problem. So everybody has that information and everybody can understand what the issues were. And on the flip side, we're spending a lot of time mining that data for what's working really well. And then we can take that and say, how do we need to take what works well and ensure that that's happening across the entire enterprise? And again, that's just happening a lot faster for us than we used to be able to do it.
That's fantastic, really giving your clients and yourself the tools right along from planning to execution so that they can really read the data, interpret it, and use that to plan, the best success for their event. So, well, thanks, Jill. It's been good speaking with you today.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it.
Now I'm going to talk about how the guest wants to move through the property. Once guests feel restored and understood, the final expectation is seamlessness. Not more service, not more interaction, but movement that feels intuitive. How a guest arrives, how they transition from public to private space, and how they encounter moments of pause or privacy without friction. In luxury hospitality, flow is no longer just a design consideration, it's a performance variable. To explore that dimension, I'm joined by Alessia Genova, Managing Partner at Tihany Design. Alessia brings the design and experiential sequencing perspective, how physical space shapes not only how guests move, but how they feel, perceive value, and interact with service. Her work sits at the intersection of aesthetics, psychology, and operational reality, where design decisions directly influence efficiency, privacy, and long-term financial performance. Alessia, it's good to speak with you today.
Good for me to speak to you today as well. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with the big picture. How do design and experiential sequencing shape the way guests move through a property? And what impact does that have on both guest perception and operational efficiency?
Well, I think I like this question because, like the way that actually we start a project is really always with the question of how do we want to move guests into the space, meaning to say, the space, what we call it, the space planning. And so the way we plan the space itself is really, first of all, is the most important aspect of what we do, even before design itself, right? And because is in this way that we can, let's say, behind the scene, decide what the guest experience, what the guest sees or no sees, and what he can remember, what he can be wowed by. And so it's kind of like, in a way that he doesn't know it's happening, we're really deciding what type of emotion he will have as he walks into a space. At the same time, to really enhance the guest experience, taking an accurate approach to how we look at the space and the flow is the way that we can, especially in luxury, really amplify the sense of luxury, because it's the way we can also move the service in an hidden way, right? Like the most important things is make sure that things happen in a way the guest doesn't see. So it's really all of like this consideration that is we have to put in place in order to make the guest feel good and make sure that there is efficiency on the other side, on the operational side. And if we can achieve both, I think that's obviously the most successful hotel, before we even look at the design of the hotel. And this starts from, obviously, the guest arrival is the first things you see. So is the lobby, is like your way to the reception. Then each hotel, in a way, even if there is like, a common, let's say, thread of where like hotels and luxury is going today, they have their own way to operate. But like what you see, what you don't see, where the reception is placed, and all of that is part of, I just said, of this sequence. And most important, it goes when we go even up to the room, right? So how like the service operates, and it through in and out of the room without being seen or in an efficient way. So there are a lot of these things that constantly are making us design the space in one way or the other one, and in every single aspect of the hotel.
And these are also important, especially when you're looking at luxury hospitality and elevating that guest experience. So where have design decisions most clearly improved flow or privacy or ease for guests without increasing staffing or costs?
Well, I think, as continuing from what I was just saying, right, is I would say when we consider in something that we actually don't design, and is the back of house. So when we are mindful of what the back of house means within the planning of a hotel, I think is when we can improve, increase, the performance for the hotel, improve the staff efficiency. Because in essence, we need to think that whenever we design the front of house, is more successful if the service and so the staff of the hotel can easily access, can easily do what he has to do. Like, again, we are talking every time, where is like the service elevator located, where is the laundry, where they put the garbage, where they storage, like, so how the staffs operate before then what the guests even experience or see, in order to ensure that everything get maximized in terms of efficiency and minimized in terms of bad visual, bad noises, things that distract from a good experience. And as part of the hotel, you have obviously the public space, the guest room, you also have the spa and the restaurants, right? So I think these is also are elements that are very important, and that is where we see a lot of these, where we put a lot of this attention, as I said, where is the circulation within the restaurant, from going in and out of the kitchen, or where the service station are placed, things that, sounds, when you know what you're doing, sounds a very obvious question, but most of the time get a little bit forget, because they might imply that your design has to compromise a little bit in order to accommodate something that maybe in a way can be less pleasant to see, or less design driven, but is really the key for an operator to be successful. So I think bringing again is the attention of like efficiency, I would say, the attention of like these details that are less guests, is what the guests don't use in a way, is what almost the guests don't really interact with, but is the service they interact with that can definitely improve the performances. And when you go to other example, when you go into the guest room, is like in these days obviously technology in a way help, and more of these practice are like common to the guest room, but it's like how even it gets planned, like the lighting system, the control of the lighting system, just making sure that this kind of like it is not overly complicated, because that could be like your next step, where you kind of, instead of being successful, you almost fail on the guest experience.
Sure, and I've heard this before, taking all of that into consideration right at the beginning of the planning stages, because it's very hard to fix it if you're like halfway through the project.
Well, like the other day I was discussing one of our designer of like, show me like a bath. It was beautiful. It was very nice design and I really like it. But then I raised the question, where is the towels bar goes and where the waste bin goes? And she was like, well, I'll figure it out later. I said, but the moment you figure it out, this design is not the same. And so we are selling something that is not going to be, like in the sense of to be, I think, a successful designer, I think, is not just be able to do something that looks good, which is very important, of course, and that's what we enjoy to do, but also be mindful of, like the functionality of these elements, and taking in consideration to ensure that your design looks good and beautiful within, like, sometimes I would say constraint or restriction that you might not have in a residential project, or it doesn't matter if it's like a bit less functional or a bit less practical, because everyone can operate in a different way. But in the hospitality and the luxury, I think there's a certain level of expectation that first and foremost is the service that cannot be in place. Again, everything else, it comes out a second layer. So that's what I'm saying. Even if I'm a designer, like, the aesthetic is almost, if it's beautiful but not functional, it will fail, right? It will be more successful than if it's very functional, less beautiful in a way, right? Because again, the expectation at the first is the service. So the designer has a big responsibility on that. Obviously, we don't operate the hotel, so we can't tell how how the staff has to operate, but in every project is a constant discussion in between the designer and the people that operate the hotel, because sometimes they come on board also when you're doing your design with requests that are totally opposite of what a designer wants to do, because they're looking only at the practical aspect. And in a way, so I think it's like, you might not go there 100%, because there is like some parameters that are still needed, important to define luxury, but it's important that you listen and then you find at least some compromise, right? We are talking about the weight of furniture. They need to move to clean. So we can just think that everything needs to be taken in consideration, and then in the consideration of like what we want this to look like, we need to understand what we let go and what instead we need to, let's say, compromise. But like all of these little things that are important for the staff is because they have less and less time to make the room. They have less and less staff that operates in a hotel. So our serious problem or serious matters that a designer has to understand. And sometimes you don't want to listen. But if you consider at the beginning of the project, definitely it is easier for you as well, design towards that needs.
So, and that leads me to the last question. What elements of luxury hotel design are being overbuilt today? You're talking a lot about, making things seamless and developing the elevated guest experience. So how does simplification actually strengthen both experience and financial performance?
I think the most successful property or assets are not necessarily the most opulent or the most complex. I think they are the most precise. I think that's what makes the most efficient. And as I was saying, understanding that some non-functional elements sometimes can create a much bigger, I would say, impact on something that, again, it can be quite destructive for the hotel. So I would say, maybe if we have to consider, I would say that a designer should focus at least on maybe 20% of what he's doing, on making sure that 20% out of the 100 that we are doing is definitely designed to provide almost 80% of efficiency for the hotel, right? So focus at least on the few key things that can really be improving or can really kind of generate enough efficiency and revenue that the other 80 can be absorbed by the 20 non being that efficient, right? So kind of try to find a very small that can give a lot, and then everything else become much more acceptable. So I think, and this comes on, it's a hard answer to say what is specifically, because I think when we talk about luxury, there is an understanding, a general understanding, but there is luxury can have different, let's say, element for different people in different parts of the world, and for different typology of project. Meaning to say, there is urban luxury, resort luxury. There is luxury that lives in places Middle East, America, Europe. So for each one of them, there is certain elements that are key to make that property luxurious. And so perhaps sometimes is a bit more richness in the design. And for some other instead is really, the design can be simpler. So it's not just necessary, I don't want to say that necessarily it's simple in terms of everything simplified, because then it cannot be like that, is definitely the only answer. But it's a simplicity on every aspect that we curate. Sometimes it's design, so it doesn't have to be overly decorated, but sometimes simplicity can be on the technology. Sometimes, I think that sometimes personalization is not personalization, is you get a bit confused with asks, and I guess doesn't want to have 20 options for one thing. So you want 3 perfect options. So the personalization is not just responding to an ask with thousands of in my opinion, with a pillow menu of 20 type of pillows. Maybe it can be 3 type of pillows, but that type of pillows have been chosen in a different way. And I'm not saying it doesn't have to be in place, because for certain people it's an expectation. So it depends where you are and where are you working. There are different priority, but it's important that priority can get also evaluated with a bit more carefully, in that sense, because it's always easy to overbuild, and is easy to do more. Is much more complicated to do less, but feel like you're doing the right things. So I think that's where is always a difficult answer, but it's and my answer is not saying do less is more. Sure, less is more, but I'm not saying nothing. I'm just saying understanding where there is that more that is not needed, and take it out compared to the property, the clients, the operator you're working with, because as I was saying, different property, especially different country, they have different needs. So the answer is not just one.
It tells me that you have a really good line of communication with your your clients and your partners, and it's so important to really understand the brief and make sure that everyone's on the same page right from the beginning.
Yes, it's a very important aspect of what we do is keeping a good communication with your clients. I mean, it's kind of like, I'm smiling because I was on a call earlier with a client, and she had an observation of something that she didn't like. And I was like, asking her why. And she was asking me why you did that. I don't understand it. And kind of like, as soon as I explained it, she was like, you sold it. Like, but it was kind of like that. From my side, it was like, it's good to have a conversation to agree or disagree. You don't always need to agree. The important thing is to have this type of conversation. And I think when you are a designer that can have a dialogue with your client, whatever, you agree or you don't agree, you decide to try to, to put your feet down and say, no, I don't do that. And I explain you why, or let it go. I think is where it definitely help also the trust and understand that what you're doing, you have a reasoning, and it's not only, at least for us, it's not only that we want to have the aesthetic we want to have, we don't care about anything else. It's like that sometimes you need to understand that certain things are important, and you can agree or disagree, and we can fight about it, but if you let it go, it might dilute the narrative. It might be the wrong choices, and in our side too, if we don't listen to them, we might get a beautiful product, but it's going to be a failure on other things. So this open line of communication, I think, and try to understand each other, and really discuss these points with the pro and the cons of each choice is what I think make the project just better.
Cool. Well, thank you, Alessia. It's been great speaking with you today.
Thank you, and I really appreciate it.
As we've heard today, the guest in 2026 isn't asking for more complexity. They're asking for experiences that are more intentional, feeling restored, feeling understood, and moving through the property with ease. For owners and operators, the opportunity is translating those expectations into decisions that strengthen both guest value and long-term asset performance. Thank you to our speakers and to Encore and Bodhi for making this webinar possible. You can find the recording under the Events tab at ilha.org.